I want to show this because you brought up Everett.
Sure.
and they're talking about Everett in Boston, and they're talking about him in New York, and they're talking about him in London, and they sure talked about him in Gettysburg. He was the keynote speaker, but he didn't keep. His speech was the one that didn't scour. Right. As Lincoln. But here's a publication, the 1864 publication of Edward Everett's speech. Why do you think that Everett's speech did not continue as an important one when they initially thought it would be?
You know, I think when Edward Everett looks out over that crowd and he sees what's going on in the back of the crowd, if he was really thinking hard, maybe he already knew that his speech was doomed. Because at the back of the crowd, when Edward Everett was giving his address, was a college professor from Pennsylvania College, now Gettysburg College, selling copies of the first book that came out on the Battle of Gettysburg, a college professor named Michael Jacobs. So what I think that means is that Edward Everett's speech at the time was great in a sense, because it was largely a history of the war, a history of the battle, and many people hadn't heard it. It's one of the reasons I think New Yorkers aren't that impressed by Everett's speech. They actually had seen lots of accounts of the battle because New York has so many newspapers. Most of these other small towns, they haven't seen accounts before. But pretty soon, books like Jacobs, books that will come out over the next few years, they're better histories of the battle than what Edward Everett has to offer. And he's talked about things that are so immediate. He's talked about these very specific people and places and events that they don't have any long-term resonance. You know, when you recite the Gettysburg Address today, you can think that it applies to nations even to this day, you know, that it still has some advice for us. Everett's speech maybe was a great performance at the time. It surely was. But it doesn't really have anything to say to us today. And that's, I think, why it fades pretty quickly.
Now, Kevin, I think the first thing I really notice about this book, what I think a lot of people really notice about it, is the way you've organized it. And to some extent, the sections are, you've labeled them Lincoln versus Herndon, Lincoln versus Seward, Lincoln versus Palmerston, Lincoln versus Marx, Lincoln versus Napoleon. This is a book about Lincoln's worldview. How was that organization helpful for you in thinking about Lincoln and his foreign policy?
A couple of things. I mean, we talked a little bit about it. I think the reason you have to organize it like that is because if you do a kind of continuous narrative of Lincoln's role in foreign policy, it makes him seem like he did too much. So I really had to narrow it down to the things that Lincoln did do in foreign policy, or which are revealing in some way. But I think it's also useful to look at Lincoln side by side with some of the other figures that were operating on the world stage at the time, because these are really interesting times. I mean, this is we've got Otto von Bismarck takes power in 1862 in Prussia, so the age of blood and iron is coming. You've got Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister of Britain, who says Britain has no eternal friends, only national interests. That's his famous line. You've got Napoleon III, the nephew of Bonaparte, in power in France. So you've got these fascinating characters on the world stage. And what really interested me about the Times is there's this kind of juxtaposition of nationalism and globalization, which I think isn't all that different from the world that we live in now. You don't want to overstate it, but we see that dynamic in our own world. You have these kind of hard-headed realists competing on the world stage. At the same time, the world is shrinking, because remember, this is an age of globalization. We saw the advent of the telegraph, the steamship, this incredible boom in newspaper publication leading up to the war. And so I think that dynamic is interesting. And you mentioned Marx. I think Marx is interesting to look at. I get a lot of grief about the Marx chapter. People have very strong feelings about Karl Marx for obvious reasons, one way or the other. But my point in this chapter was not that Lincoln and Marx knew each other, which they didn't, or even that they really influenced each other in any way, which I don't really think they did. Although Marx was writing in the years leading up to the Civil War for the New York Tribune, which had a huge circulation in the U.S. Marx wrote 300 or 400 articles for the Tribune, some of them on the front page, and Lincoln, we know, read the Tribune pretty religiously, so he may have read it. It's kind of interesting to think of him sprawling out in the Lincoln Herndon law offices in Springfield,
Right.
possibly reading Marx, but we don't know. So, but what was interesting to me is that is to look at these two side by side, because something really interesting was happening, and I think it tells you something about the world at the time, and that's that the nature of power was changing. Because of some of these innovations that we talked about, the equivalent, what we today would call soft power, was beginning to have some role, and ordinary people were having more and more of a role in the affairs of state. And so both Marx and Lincoln were wrestling with how to operate in this new world. How do you shape public opinion when you can, and how do you react to public opinion? One of the interesting things is it was a period where nothing was private anymore. There's a great line from the French Empress Eugenie at the time, and she says, "Diplomacy has so few secrets nowadays." This was 150 years before WikiLeaks and all that, so we can relate, but it's true. And Lincoln also had this guy, do you remember this guy, Jofi Joseph, a month or two ago in Washington? They called him the Twitter mole, and he was saying, he was tweeting out kind of things about President Obama and Secretary Kerry. Well, Lincoln had his own equivalent of a Twitter mole at the time, this guy, Count Adam Gorowski, who was a Polish count who was working at the State Department. He published his diary at the height of the Civil War, in the early years of the Civil War, and he called Lincoln Pighead Lincoln, and he said he was working for Seward. He wrote that his job was to keep Seward from making a fool of himself. This was his boss, and so he had to be fired, just like this guy Joseph was. So he had to deal with both the advantages and the drawbacks of this globalized
Does this look
world.
like? Do you think this is the first time when you can see a non-government person, at least in this period, a non-government person, a writer such as Marx, exert influence on government? I mean, could Marx exert some influence on? Never mind Marx. How about Marx's boss?
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I'm always wary when I hear, is this the first time? Because that's an invitation for historians to start sending you emails. No, that wasn't the first time, but it was. But you're right in that the world was changing, and Lincoln felt like both Lincoln and Marx realized that ordinary people, especially in Britain and France, could play some role in international affairs in the way that they hadn't before. And Lincoln's hope was, he viewed the Emancipation Proclamation partly as a tool of international relations. He felt like if he could reach across the Atlantic and talk to some of these ordinary European mill workers in places like Manchester and Liverpool, that were suffering because of the shortages of cotton, if he could make a kind of moral appeal, change the goal from union to anti-slavery, then that might have some effect on them and might convince them to put some pressure on the aristocratic statesmen, people like Palmerston and Napoleon. He was partly right about that. In the long run, he was right. He was partly wrong about it, too, because they didn't have as much power as he hoped and thought they might.
So influencing a popular movement might have more traction than one writer or one voice outside the government.
Right, and Marx really was one voice. Marx, in some ways, was like a blogger in his in the dispatches that he published. Marx would basically read the newspapers of the time. He would sit in the reading room of the British Library. He would read the Times and the other newspapers from throughout the world, and he would kind of comment on them. He didn't really do much of his own reporting. He would kind of, it reminds me very much of what, kind of modern day blogger does. He kind of sift through the material that's out there and kind of write snarky things about it. And that's sort of what Marx was doing.
We got a question from the internet. Thank you very much. It's for you, Jared. And it comes from Kara in the Woodlands, Texas. And Kara just studied the Gettysburg Address in her 7th grade class, and I trust that you did very well. But I can tell she did, because she says she understands that Lincoln considered the Gettysburg Address a flat failure, and that the people who listened to it were not impressed. And is this true, and why is it? Because she thinks it's the greatest speech of all time. Thank you, Kara.
I'm glad you have that opinion. It's a great question, and when I first started this project when I was an undergrad, the first thing I looked at was the immediate responses in the town of Gettysburg. And the reason I did that was because I was struck by this question too of what did people really think at the time? Because you do see these conflicting accounts. It's the greatest speech ever, it was a flat failure. And so what's really the truth? And I started off thinking if I could look at just the people from Gettysburg, and I could get every account I could find from them, that maybe I could sort of get to the bottom of that question. And I never could in the end, unfortunately. So I think maybe the best way to sum it up is this. It's hard to know whether there was applause or not. The accounts that people write over time, some people say there was applause, some people say that there wasn't applause. Most of the people that were there said that they were impressed with the speech, and those that noted that there was not applause gave one of two reasons. They said either that they didn't realize Lincoln had finished until he was already sitting down and they were moving on to the next thing, and then there was sort of some perfunctory applause at the end, but people weren't sure what was even going on. Or, on the other hand, you've got to remember this is a funeral. So when was the last time you clapped at a funeral? And that's another reason potentially why there wasn't applause as well. So what was the response at the time? This notion that the speech was a flat failure comes from Ward Hill Lamon, who was a friend of Lincoln's. He was there that day, and he would claim 15 years later or so that Lincoln had told him as he sat down, Lamon, the speech was a flat failure, the people aren't happy. That doesn't seem to really be the case. It seems that Lincoln understood almost from the start that the speech had been well received. Edward Everett, the main speaker, writes to him the next day and says, I hope I came to as close to the central idea in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. So I think the reception at the time was largely positive by the people that were there. I think when you look at the newspaper reception around the country, it's pretty predictable. The Republicans said it was the greatest thing ever, and the Democrats said it was an absolute shame. It's not surprising that they're dividing in that way. But I think your wish is fulfilled, because I do think that people at the time saw it as being a great speech.
Well, I have a question. It's going to end up being a good follow-up for Kara's question. I'm going to leap forward a little bit. When and how did the speech start to take hold in public education? When did 7th graders start memorizing the Gettysburg Address?
That's a great question. One of the things that I looked at in my dissertation, I had an entire chapter on educational uses. I broke it up for the book into the different periods. Pretty quickly after the Civil War, it starts to appear in readers. We have to keep in mind that most states didn't have compulsory high school education, and therefore they didn't have compulsory history classes even until into the 20th century. In Virginia, for example, I think it's 1906 is the first time that Virginia passes a compulsory high school education for everybody. So kind of how we think about how students are taught history, how they might have learned the Gettysburg Address, it's really different in that era. So it'll start appearing in readers, it'll start to be memorized by people in 7th grade as maybe early as the 1880s, maybe even earlier than that. If you look at textbooks going into the 20th century, again, there's a pretty obvious split. If it's a textbook that was written for the North, the Gettysburg Address is in it. If it's a textbook that's written for the South, it's not. And that's a pattern that will persist until the 1960s.
And as we've seen from Daniel's story that he told us at the beginning, by the turn of the 20th century, Chinese school children under Sun Yat-sen's rule were memorizing the Gettysburg.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that same year, 1978, there's another event sort of similar to the story that Dan told. In 1978, of course, there were the Camp David Accords, and President Carter and Begin and Sadat were really getting nowhere. They went to Gettysburg to take sort of a day off from the negotiating. And Sadat, not surprisingly, knew the battlefield pretty well as they were touring around. But when they got to the cemetery, Begin closed his eyes and recited the Gettysburg Address from memory. He had learned it as a young boy in Israel. So, Israel and China at the same time. The Gettysburg Address is a speech that was being memorized around the world, not just here in our country.